Hey, in this video, I'm going to be teaching you how to paint a loose anemone flower using watercolor. So this is a modern style of painting. We're going to be using wet and wet technique for the majority of the piece, which is super fun. And your outcome is going to look something like this. Super fun, very vibrant and colorful. Make sure to check the description out below for the links to all my supplies and all of that good stuff before you get started. And let's paint. Okay, so for today's video and for always, whenever I'm painting with watercolor, I'm always using these same supplies. Sometimes I'll switch it up here and there, but pretty much for florals, I predominantly use round brushes. So I will use these Princeton Heritage 4050 series round brushes. I only use synthetic hair brushes, no natural hair brushes for me because they're too expensive. They're really snappy, really flexible. I love them. I go into a lot more detail on how to use your brushes and whatnot in my book, Everyday Watercolor. And then I also have a floral watercolor book coming out June 2019 that you can pre-order on Amazon, linked below, where I talk all about supplies, how to use them, why it's good to have high quality supplies, etc. So, but for today's video, I'm only going to be using one brush. It is the same series, the same brand, Princeton Heritage 4050 brush, but it's the size 6 brush. So this is the medium brush that I use. I use a size 16, a size 6, and a size 2 for all of my paintings. And again, sometimes I'll add in a couple brushes here and there, but for the most part, these 3 brushes are the go-tos. But for today, I'm only going to be using the size 6. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to paint an anemone flower using a loose wet and wet technique. Wet and wet technique, if you don't know what it is literally what it is, what the title is. It is what it sounds like. So basically you can use water on your paper, and while that water is still wet, you can punch in color and it will move and blend and diffuse. So the diffusing is really fun to see because it's kind of like magic. It's the best part of watercolor in my opinion. But wet and wet, you can use it for more detailed, more realistic paintings, and you can also use it for loose style of paintings. And for today, we're going to do a more basic loose approach to wet and wet technique. I always have 2 cups of water on my desk when I'm painting so I can separate warm and cool colors, or at least have one water that's for clean water and the other for dirty water for rinsing off, if that's how you prefer. But I like to have my reds, oranges, pinks, yellows, etc. rinsed off in this cup, and then my blues, greens, and yellows off in this cup. So we're not mixing contrasting colors like red and green, for example, in the same cup and getting brown water, because contrasting colors usually mixes up brown. So that leaves us with having clean water for the most part. It's going to be red and blue water eventually. So we're not using brown water to contaminate our colors. Just convenient. So I am going to be painting a bluish violet-ish tone anemone flower. You can choose to paint. I have this just scratch piece of paper that I was painting on really quickly the other day, but this anemone is the red and white variation. There's like this red violet one. So you can look at it, pull up a photo of an anemone flower if you're feeling a lack of inspiration for color or for perspective or whatever. I'm just going to show you a straight down, looking straight at the face of the anemone perspective in a blue violet tone, and you can go from there. Keep practicing. It's a really fun way to paint. So I'm going to load up with water on my size 6 brush. I get the question a lot about how much water to use when painting wet and wet. And my answer is it really depends on the amount of surface that you're covering. So if you're doing a full-blown wash from top to bottom on your paper, you're going to want a lot of water on your brush because you have a lot of area to cover. But if you're just painting a little 2-3 inch petal, you don't want your brush soaking wet with water because you're going to create what I like to call a wall of water. So when you have a really thick puddle of water on your paper, it's going to create a wall of water. So when you go to punch in color and you want to see that beautiful diffusing action happening, it's not going to happen because that puddle of water is acting like a wall. It's blocking the color from blending and diffusing, and so it just sits there. When you go for that big, punchy, bold effect of wet and wet, it's just going to go bloop. It'd be a really sad, just stop right there in place. So we don't want that. We want it to burst and to blend and to get all crazy and really fun to look at. So you want to, for about this size area that you're covering for this petal, you want to just get it so it's glistening in the light, but not dripping with water. So there's no water droplets coming off. But before we get to the petals, I'm going to start with the center of the flower. So the center of anemone flowers is black, straight up black. You can do, if you're doing more realistic, there's going to be different shades of black, different tones of black. You're not going to have straight jet black. You're going to have like brown blacks, gray, purple blacks, blue blacks, etc. But for this black, I'm just painting a loose style floral. It's in a modern style, so I'm just going to load up with the color Mars Black. All of the paint that I use is from Winsor & Newton, and it's all professional level. Every artist is different, so definitely explore supplies and different materials that kind of suit your style and what you like to use, but this is what I prefer to use, and I really dig them. I get really great results from them, from these colors. All right, so I'm loading up with a really thick amount of black on my brush, and I'm not just getting the tip of my brush coated in black. I'm getting the full brush, so all the way from belly to tip. Because I'm also going to be using the belly of the brush for strokes, I don't want just the tip covered in black. So I'm going to come to about the center of my paper, and I'm just going to point and press and kind of make this little circle outline. Maybe grab a little bit more water so I can load up with a tad bit more black. I want this to be opaque. I don't want it to be transparent. So the more water you have on your brush and the less pigment you have on your brush, the more transparent the color will be. If you have less water to paint ratio, you're gonna have a thicker color, so it's gonna be more opaque. Pretty straightforward stuff. So we have our center right here, and now I'm just going to kind of use the point of my round brush and dot around. So I'm just going to use the tip of my round tip brush and just make dots all the way around the center of the circle. I'm staggering the dots around the circle and in height, in distance away from the actual the center of the flower, the bulb. But I'm also changing up the size of each dot or stamen so that it doesn't look generic and it doesn't look too uniform. So all of my dots are kind of different sizes, and they're also different distances away from the bulb or the center of the flower. So I'm going to clean my brush off from here because I'm going to get a new color, or actually I'm just going to get plain water. So I'm going to start with just plain water for my petals, and then I'm going to punch in color. So I'm going to completely wash this brush off by smashing my brush on the bottom of the jar, and then getting rid of the excess water by swiping on the edge of my jar. And then I'm going to get new water. So I don't want to grab this gray water right here because it's going to contaminate the color of my petals. So I want to grab just this fresh water over here. So that's what I mean by rinsing off your brush in 1 cup of water to get, so basically this is just going to be the dirty water, this is going to be the clean water. So once you clean your brush off, you're going to wipe it off on either your paper towel or the edge of your jar, and then grab clean water to pick up more paint, instead of grabbing that and grabbing more paint with contaminated water on your brush. So now I'm going to grab just water, and I'm starting with this as my base color. Even though it's an empty color, it's just water. We're just going to be basically painting imaginary petals with water. And so I'm going to grab fresh water, and I'm not going to go straight to my paper like this where my brush is dripping with water. Again, that's going to create the wall of water effect. So I'm going to swipe 2 or 3 times on the edge of my jar, maybe just a tad more. But anytime I'm painting a flower, especially one where I'm looking directly at the eye or the bulb of the flower, you want to make sure you're pointing all of your petals back to that bulb, or back to that center point of the flower, because that's where all of them meet. The bulb, the stamen, the pollen, etc., and the petals meet where the tip of the stem is, and it's right under the bulb of the flower. So if you have a petal that maybe your bulb is here and you have a petal that's pointing straight up or straight down and not back towards the center of the flower, the bulb, it's going to look really whack and the proportions are going to be off. People are going to look at it and not know why it looks so funky or so weird, but it's because the proportions are off. So let's make sure we point our round brush like this to the center of the flower with every single petal. So if that means you have to rotate your paper as you're painting so it feels comfortable, I like to pull my strokes for my petals towards me. I don't like to push away from me. That's just my preference, and it makes me feel like I have more control. So definitely rotate your paper around. I'm painting on a block of watercolor paper. Again, all the descriptions and links for the supplies are in the description below. So I have just plain water on my brush, and I'm painting a loose anemone flower. This type of flower has anywhere from 5 to 8 to 4 sometimes petals, but I want it to be a star shape. I don't want it to be a box. I don't want it to be a triangle. I want it to be a star-shaped flower so that it feels kind of uneven, but that's just the most natural look if you're painting loosely. If you have 4 petals, it's just going to create a box. But with 5, we kind of have that uneven, natural look. So I'm going to paint a 5-petal flower, a star-shaped flower, and again, starting with water. So I'm going to start with this kind of not straight down in the middle on the bottom here petal, but I'm going to go to the right. So I'm going to point with my round brush at about 45 degrees away from the paper is my angle. So I can point, press, and loop down. So I've got water here and I'm just wetting the surface. I'm just going to grab a little bit of blue so you can actually see that. So point, press, and loop down. So we're kind of doing each petal in 3 parts. I have the outside of the petals, or like the parentheses, and then we have the meat or the body of the petals. I don't know, I'm just making that up. That's not technical terms or anything, but I'm a visual person, so I like to think of the outside edge of the petals as parentheses. The sides are pointing in to the body or the meat of the petal, or like a sandwich, a hamburger. I love hamburgers. With my first stroke, I'm pointing, pressing, and kind of curving, doing the C curve as I come up to the top edge of the petal, and then same thing with the other outside edge. Whereas the middle, I'm just kind of brushing it to fill it in. And then we have these nice pointed, this nice pointed base that points back to the center of the flower. And because I have this nice wet petal, as you can see if you kind of take a side view angle on the petal, you can see that it's glistening, but it's also not a raised petal, so it's not going to be that wall of water. We have the perfect scenario for doing wet and wet. So I'm going to load up with a lot of Prussian blue on my brush, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create wet and wet technique on both the base of each petal and the top of each petal so that it kind of diffuses towards the center. So it's dark and rich at both ends, and then it gets softer and softer. It's kind of like a gradient towards the middle of the petal. So if we have the center of the flower right here is really dark, and then the outside edge or the tip of the petal is also really dark. So it kind of looks like it's kind of bending up. So I'm going to start with the base of each petal, and I'm just going to grab the tip of my brush. It's loaded up with a lot of Prussian blue on it, and I'm going to poke it into the base of my petal, watch it bleed, and then move on to the top of the petal, and then follow with the rest of the petals. Okay, so as you are adding in color for wet and wet technique, you want to make sure that you're not overdoing it so that you're basically just creating a blue petal. So what I start with is just water, making sure it's not the wall of water, and then I'm plugging in some blue, a little tinge of black with it sometimes, to the base of the petal. And if you punch on the color when you place in the color and you want to create more of a diffused look or more of a burst, you can punch on that spot and it'll spread more. But make sure to not overdo that. And then also go to the top of the petal, do the same thing. I like the look of having the gradient where it fades in the middle. So it's the lightest in the middle of the petal and then darkest on both the base and the tip. So if you overdo it, what you can do is you can dry your brush off or grab a paper towel and soak up some of that pigment while it's still wet, and you'll kind of lift it or erase that color in the middle there. You can also drag some of the dark color with a thin stroke using the tip of your round brush to give it kind of like a vein look or a creased look. Just don't overdo it. Start small, take a step back and look at what you're doing and making sure that you're not so zoned in that you can't actually see what you're doing, and then you pull away and you realize, oh shoot, I just messed that up or whatever. So now I'm going to move on to my next petal. Again, I want all of my petals to point back to the center of the flower, so I'm going to be rotating my paper, holding my brush again at a 45-ish degree angle away from the paper, just starting with water with a little tint of blue on it so you can see it, but just starting with water, pointing back to the center of the flower. Point, press, it's a little dark, point, press, and curve in like a parentheses. And when you press on the brush, you should see it fanning out. If you have a really coarse hair brush, it might not fan out as much as mine are. It really is important that you're using supplies that you want to achieve certain results. Your supplies really do matter. So I'm using the Snappy synthetic hair brush from Princeton, and they're amazing. So they're really flexible. And now I'm going to do the middle of this petal. I like the middle of my petals to be kind of like the tallest spot, so it kind of comes up like that to the middle. So point, press, and curve in. Okay, so now I have the base of this petal, and I'm going to do the same exact thing. Grab some dark blue, wet and wet action, watch that burst, it's pure magic. And let it diffuse. Don't overdo it. Just kind of put some down, take a step back, and move to the top. And then after you're done with the top, if you decide maybe the base needs a little bit more blue, maybe a little bit of black, then you can. But you don't want to do it all right away. All right, so I've got my second petal done. Now I'm just gonna do the same exact steps for the next 3 petals. Again, if you are deciding you want 6 petals, by all means, have 6 petals, but I prefer the look of 5 as a star-shaped flower. It's just what I think looks the most natural, but you do you. So I'm gonna continue, I'm gonna rotate my paper, so continue to add the steps, and we'll meet up on our last petals. Okay, so now that all of my petals are pretty much done, I'm going back and I'm just darkening areas, adding a little bit more texture and fluff to each petal so it doesn't just look like a teardrop or a sphere with like a clean edge at the top. So I'm just going in and I'm adding like tiny little brush strokes and darkening. If your petal is dry and you want to add texture to it, you just have to make sure you paint over the entire petal. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard line because you're going to have layers of watercolor on top of watercolor. So you're going to have the underneath showing where it has the clean edge, and then you paint over top of it so it'll have the hard line underneath because it's transparent. So make sure you paint over the full petal, or if you have just water on your brush, you can kind of do these tiny circular motions, or what I like to call them as brushing your teeth motions, to kind of try and lift that color from underneath it up so it doesn't create that hard line of that like perfect teardrop edge or circular edge. So I'm just going to go in and add a bit more texture, darken some areas, and then we can call it a day on the actual flower. I'm also going to add a stem and leaves to this so you can see how I do that as well. But once you're ready, pick up for stem and leaves, add some texture, add some movement to your flower, and make sure you're leaving some area of the petal where there's like a less saturation of color. So the value or the lightness or darkness is a much lighter value in the center or somewhere on the petal. Okay, so now that I've got my petals pretty much done, I'm going to completely rinse my brush off. I didn't keep the clean water, dirty water thing like I said I would, but it's fine because I'm just going to add green, blue, mix up green with yellow, so I'm fine with it. So I'm just going to grab some of this blue water because I don't want like a muted green, I want a green. I'm going to grab some of this blue water and some of my sap green from Winsor Permanent Sap Green. A lot of it on my brush, so I'm grabbing and rolling it around in my dish of sap green. La la la. And then I'm going to make it a yellow green because I don't want it too hunter green or too traditional green, straightforward, straight up, whatever the technical term is. I want it to be a yellow green so it feels really bright next to this dark blue. So we have a yellow green on our brush. Grab a little bit of water because the mixture feels a bit thick on my brush. If you're like, what do you mean it feels thick? Let me tell you. When it feels like the brush is kind of smacking when it hits the paint, like it's making that smacking sound, literally, you're mixing up like you're mixing up mud. Think of it that way. You don't want the consistency of mud feeling on your brush. It's just gonna kind of feel like mud. It's gonna feel like mud when you put it on the paper. It's gonna feel like that on your brush. So you want it to glide a little bit more, but also you don't want that wall of water, so you don't want the consistency of actual water. You want it to be just a little bit more wet than mud. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So I'm just gonna grab a little touch of water. So I barely went into my water cup just to pick up a little bit more water so that I know that this color will glide on my paper and give me a full coverage stroke. So I'm gonna start from the base of the stem, and I've got my brush angled up pretty high. It's like at 75 degrees. I'm gonna point and drag. So I'm basically pivoting from my elbow, kind of like the hand of a clock or a compass. And I'm going to just glide up using my arm. I'm not gonna press down on the brush because that's gonna create a really wide stem. I want it to be pretty thin. So I'm gonna push down for the first bit. So I'm just kind of pressing down on the base of the stem just to give it a little bit of thickness. And then for the rest of the stem, I'm keeping a really steady hand and forearm kind of connected and staying straight. And then I'm pivoting from my elbow resting my forearm on the table or on my paper for stability, and then I'm just dragging it all the way up to point back to the center of the flower. Always point back to the center of the flower with your stems, with your petals, etc., because that is where the entire flower connects, essentially. So I have this stem. I'm going to thicken it a little bit by just going back over it with more of those same strokes, maybe grab some more paint. And then I'm going to have these little offshoot stems. You can go whatever direction you want to, but just make sure you're kind of grabbing the main stem and then curving out. Don't just plug these shoots anywhere on the stem where they just like kind of plug in like an arm of a stick figure. You want it to curve out. You want it to be a nice smooth flow out of the main stem instead of just like plugged in. So I'm curving out of the main stem with all of these little offshoots. And I love the yellow-green bleeding into the blue petals. So if you can, work really quickly from petals to stem. That's ideal in my opinion. I love the burst of colors. I think it's just interesting to look at. So now I have my stems laid out. This doesn't have to be final. I'm going to continue adding stems and leaves where I see fit. I kind of like similar to the petals as I'm doing the wet and wet stuff. I'm always doing a stem here and there, taking a step back and looking how it's coming out, and then adding leaves, etc., and kind of going with the flow, making sure to kind of be in this weird limbo between turning your brain off and then fully using your brain. I know it sounds confusing, but it's called flow. All right, so now I'm going to add in leaves. I don't want to just perfectly frame the flower, so I'm going to go onto these offshoots first, see where it leads me. I have this stem kind of going behind the petals here, so I'm going to have a leaf poking out behind it that points back to that stem that it would be attached to. Don't just randomly plug in leaves where you think, oh, a leaf should be here and kind of pointing over here. That it all has to make sense. So we have to point back to the main stem or to the offshoot stem, whatever it would be connected to. Don't just plug it in, just like you would the offshoots of stems. So I'm going to start down here and add a leaf first. So I'm making sure all of my leaves have some sort of point back to point. Not sure if that makes sense, but basically I want my leaves to look like they're growing out of a stem. So if they're framing the flower, they need to somehow be curving towards, kind of alluding towards that they came from this stem or that stem, and not just kind of plugging them at random. And changing up my values of leaves, so making sure I'm not just using a dark green for all of my leaves. So if you want to lighten up your value, all you got to do, if you have a really thick amount of paint on your brush and you just used it for a leaf and you want that same color or hue, but you just want a slightly lighter version, you can go to your water cup and kind of flick it around to release pigment or lighten it, and then always swipe off that excess, and then you have a lighter version of that color. And again, this is a loose style of painting. I'm not referencing a photo, so I'm not making sure that every single leaf is placed in the exact position it needs to go based on a photo. It's basically just kind of based off of flow and feeling. So I like to look at the rule of thirds and just kind of making sure that I never have like a box or a frame around a flower. So if I were to put another leaf up here in the left-hand corner, then that would make a 4. But right now I have 3 leaves kind of framing the flower instead of 4, and then also just kind of, it's a thing of nature, so there's tons of leaves, it's chaotic at times, etc. So I kind of have leaves dancing around the stem, some pointing that way, some pointing that way, up, down, whatever. So don't put yourself in a box, just kind of feel it. But also, if you don't know what I mean by feel it, you just got to put paint on paper. If you have never really gotten over that hump of like, ooh, I just don't know where to put this next leaf, you just have to put that next leaf. And if it doesn't look good, put it off to the side, start over, and keep painting. The more you paint and the more you make mistakes while you paint, the more you're going to learn. And you're going to learn, oh, that curve looks better there next to that type of stem, or next to that petal, or whatever. Or pouring out this way looks like really natural. So the more you paint, it's just based on a feel, and I can't teach feel. You have to practice in order to get that feel. I know that sounds like hippy dippy or like woohoo, but if you know what I'm talking about, then you know what I'm talking about, and you'll get there with practice. So keep practicing, but basically, rule of thumb, if there's ever any rules to nature, you can't put nature in a box, but if you were to kind of sum it up a little bit, there's always an originating point. So petals, stems, stamen, etc., they all come back to one part, and that's the main stem. They're growing out of the ground, obviously, from roots. So the stem comes out first, and then we got a little bud, and then it spreads out, and they're all connected. So when you pluck off those petals, you're plucking it off of one point. No, I'm just rambling. But it makes sense, I'm sure. And if you look at a flower in nature up close, you'll know what I'm talking about. So have fun with this. Keep practicing it. Make sure to tag me on Instagram. If you're on Instagram and you're posting your work, make sure you're commenting below with what you loved about this painting, what you didn't love, whatever. I'm open for anything. But I would love to hear from you, love to hear feedback, and I would also love to see your practice and your work practicing this loose anemone flower. So make sure to tag me on Instagram at Jenna Rainey. It's linked below. And stay tuned for more videos like this, and I'm excited to see your work. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you paint your little heart out and you have a fun time painting this loose style of anemone flower. But before you go, please make sure you subscribe to our channel, like this video, and comment below. We're doing a giveaway of this actual piece that I just painted, and I will sign it for you. So one lucky winner, will win this piece if you do those 3 things. So make sure you're subscribed to our channel, you like this video, and you comment below whatever you want to comment. Your favorite flower, what you're excited about, what your week looks like, what your day looks like, your middle name. I don't care. Just make it good, clean, fun. Nothing crazy. And we'll choose a winner. We'll choose a winner at random, and that winner will be sent this piece. So get painting, get commenting, liking, and subscribing.